Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me? So I'm conscious of the fact that we've just had lunch and people might be a bit sleepy, so I'm doing a slightly bit of an interactive thing to start off with. Can I have a raise of hands who has taken an Uber since they've been in Lisbon this week? Okay, that's pretty good. Who has used a car sharing service in the last 6 months? Okay, that's actually better than I thought it was going to be. So we're here to talk about how we're going to navigate the cities of the future. We have 3 great panelists to discuss this. I want to start off with Jose and your perspective, just to get us started off. Walk me through what are the issues we're facing right now when it comes to the city infrastructure and getting around a city, and where would you see us going in the next 10, 15 years?
There's a lot of things going on. That's the first thing. So it's difficult to make a clear navigation chart. We know there will be electrification. We know there will be automation. And these 2 things together, they open a very clear space for quickly reducing marginal costs of travel. That opens the possibility for professional services that will replace car ownership, but also the possibility that we would have much more mobility than today. And so very, very heavy congestion. Even if all the cars are electric, you get a very green congestion, but a very hard one. So one of the critical things is what are the incentives that governments will define so that people have better mobility, but less congestion and less emissions. And for that, we absolutely need smart charging rules. This is, in any case, inevitable because of the reduction of the fuel duties. In no European country, the percentage of the tax revenue of the state coming from fuel duties is less than 6%, which is huge. It's typically the 3rd largest source of tax income. And because of the demise of fossil fuel cars, this will go down. And our ministers of finance need that money. No minister of finance can abdicate from 6% of the total revenue. And the solution has to be road charges, but it cannot be a kilometer charge. It has to be much smarter than that. It has to be connected with the quality of service you receive, and that means fighting congestion. It has to be connected with the cleanliness of your vehicle, and also whether your vehicle is in shareable mode or not. Because the secret to all of this is to increase the average occupancy of the vehicle. Otherwise, we will not move. Simple as that. So this is a very central point. We need smart road charging, and we need to start discussing it now. Because if we do it too late, when ministers of finance get in panic, they move straight on and no other minister is able to stop them.
Gotcha.
So the discussion is very urgent. How should we move so that we have better, safer, smarter mobility with the appropriate fiscal regime, which provides the incentives for good consumer behavior?
Gotcha. So that's a very top-down view on what the policymakers are discussing. Let's turn to Jeff at Uber. How do you see the company fitting into what Jose was discussing?
I mean, very, very aligned on the messages. We're obviously proceeding to build this as a business. So ride sharing was as a business implements a lot of these principles. It takes a vehicle that is 4% utilized as an individually owned car and starts to now amortize that across many, many riders. And then, as I described earlier in my talk this morning, as we scaled, we were able to start combining trips into a single car, so increasing the load factor and getting the occupancy up. That's been very effective. That at sort of peak times, we see that getting most usage, and it gets up to 50% of our trips in cities, all around the world. So that's really exciting. We even have Uber Pool live here in Lisbon right now, which is exciting. So there's that, and then there's of course what I was talking about earlier is taking to the skies. So we're working on autonomy, we're working on pooling, we're working all of these capabilities on the ground. But there's also this, this trend line of density of populations in cities going up, and we also believe believe that as the price of transportation goes down, demand will increase, just classic elasticity. And so, and if you actually decongest the roads and make it less expensive, more people will take to the roads. So much of that will fill back in. Yep. And so what we're looking for is significantly increased bandwidth of transportation, and that's why we think that Uber Air, doing these aircraft that are using the ride-sharing model are really important.
Mm-hmm. So turning to Finland, not exactly a country known for its significant density of population. When I was looking at OP and what you guys do, I mean, you're a bank. So my first question is, what is a bank doing in the mobility space? Can you walk us through, A, what does that mean? And secondly, what are you learning from your customers who are using your services?
Yeah, well, that's a question I get a lot. What is the bank doing in mobility? Well, actually, it's quite logical, because already today we sell finance and insurance for the car owners, and we see a huge mega trend where the young actually, they don't want to buy cars, but they want to use other mobility options. Maybe they use Uber or active transport modes or public transport, and they're moving into cities. So car ownership is not really anymore the symbol of freedom in mobility. So, we need to look at new business revenues in these finance and insurance products, and we also believe that actually the customers of us also, they actually want to buy safe and easy travel from A to B, not insurance or finance as such. So we want to take the customer experience further and offer the full mobility service for him or her. So that's why. So now we are working on mobility services like shared cars and car leasing in a new modern way.
Mm. So the idea being is if I want to rent a car, or is it typical car sharing service? How does it actually work?
Yeah, we have a few services now. We started working on mobility 2 years ago at the bank. And since a year we've had POLITICO, which is a car leasing service for electric cars only, that you order online, and we actually bring the car to your home or office to test drive it. Then another service is a seasonal car, where you can actually use a car for 1 month or 2 months, so you don't need to buy the car to fulfill those needs where you need the car to, because we all know that sometimes we need to have a car. So our mission is to really give you the full flexibility and freedom of mobility without owning a car. So introducing other ways of using a car when you need one. So we are building car using services from minutes to years. So then we also have Drive Now car sharing that we operate in Finland, that is a minute rent. So from minutes to years, and then those services you can combine with public transport and bike sharing and other modes of transport.
So we have 3 different perspectives. From a sort of a top-down policymakers, we've got obviously Uber doing what you're doing, and then from a financial services component. All of this, though, is based on having the right rules in place for it to work, be it sort of electric cars, be it the Elevate service that you announced today. Where do you find the friction points when it comes to policymakers? I mean, Jose, maybe with your OECD experience, where are policymakers, everyone wants to be open to digital, everyone wants to be, building the city of the future, but where do you see some of those friction points coming in?
There's 2 factors in general which limit positive evolution in this. The first is something which to a higher or lower degree we all have, which is fear of change. The second one is that for people in politics, there are a lot of vested interests from incumbents, which aggravates the fear of change. So these are the 2 biggest things. But there's another difficulty, which is, even if you want to change, there's let me call it a technical difficulty, which is the traditional way in which our governments and parliaments produce legislation and regulation is simply too slow. Because the regulated object is moving too fast for that traditional way. So we have to develop new ways of producing and applying legislation and regulation, which is because we generate so much data from the life of the regulated object, we have to go to a more abstract level to first order principles in the regulations, and then say the parameters will be updated on a monthly basis or something like that based on the data that the system generates itself. The problem is our politicians and many of our people in companies are not used to think in terms of those first order principles, and it's very difficult to communicate. I've tried it several times, and people are always telling me, can you give me an example? Can you give me an example? And when you stick to the examples, you've lost that generality. So this is a fundamental change in the way to produce that common good, which we hope it is common good, which is legislation and regulation. So the framework process, the process of producing the framework also has to change because of the speed of change. And that is probably the most difficult barrier because it's deep in the minds of the vast majority of us.
So Jeff, I saw you nodding your head about the slowness of policy change.
We know nothing about that.
So, I mean, again, Uwe's had his issues with regulators both in the States, Europe, and elsewhere. But when I saw your announcement this morning about the Elevate program, maybe call me a skeptic. I think a lot of policymakers would be kind of freaked out by the idea, at least initially. Can you walk us through your discussions with the FAA? How do you get something like that literally off the ground?
Yes, that's a good pun. So we are actually, so far very, very happy with the engagements we've had with regulators on this front. Unlike on the ground, where we were up against entrenched interests, where the legislation, and actually there's a tricky problem to solve even with first principles legislation because entrenched interests will still try to craft it into something specific, right? It's really tricky sort of loop to try to crack. That's not the case with Elevate. Elevate is is really creating something new. We're trying to bring urban aviation into existence, and there's really nothing that's it's displacing per se. And so the regulatory bodies are basically trying to ensure it's safe. That's the primary objective. And the FAA has a kind of a reputation of being incredibly slow, but they've also made some big changes recently that have made it so things move much more quickly. And both FAA and EASA, which is the European kind of equivalent, are very leaned into this vision because it's got a lot of characteristics about it that are very attractive. It's it's being built for everyone. It's not some sort of a rich person's toy. It's being built from day one all electric, so it's emissions free, and so it's very good for the environment. It's being built very, very carefully to reduce the noise signature to make it so it's quiet and doesn't disrupt the environment. And so so what we found is that and basically everyone we've talked to wants to live in the world where they have this service. So we're finding that they're very leaned in, they're very engaged. And the fact that we've brought a whole ecosystem to it makes it very real. And the FAA, for example, with Part 23, not to get technical on this, but Part 23, which is the certification for a small fixed-wing aircraft, that has now become what's called a consensus-based standard. So the old way it worked was you would go to the FAA and say, I need a certification basis for an aircraft, and they would write it. But they'd have a super long queue of work to do. They never really would get to these things. It would take a decade plus if it ever happened. Now the industry can come together in a consensus format, create the spec itself, and then the FAA approves it. And then the FAA holds you accountable to make sure you deliver an aircraft that aligns with it. That's actually going quite fast. And the drone regulations that have happened, even though there was an initial kind of slow start, followed a similar kind of path where industry came together and wrote the Part 107 guidelines, and that's why that's advanced. And now there's a lot of attention that we're actually benefiting from with Elevate on moving that forward and going beyond line of sight and solving for autonomy. These are all really important things for us. So honestly, on the regulatory front, I thought that would be the longest pole by far, but what's actually going to be the longest pole, I think, is actually building the aircraft, which is funny. I mean, that's what you want as a technologist.
Sure. And when it comes to Finland, I was in Helsinki earlier this year, and they have specific rules in place where you can have autonomous buses on the street right now. And I thought that was kind of an interesting perspective, particularly coming from a small country like Finland. Can you walk us through, again, I know it's not your project, but how does that fit in with sort of Finland Inc. and its positioning with its regulation about where it fits in autonomous driving?
Yeah, Finland truly aims to be very innovative in policies and legislation as well. So it is allowed to drive with autonomous cars or buses on streets, among other traffic. So we have had 2 years now these autonomous buses driving around as public transport, so you can actually hop in and have a ride and go to the next station, even though it's quite slow still, but anyway. So another legislation that we are working on right now is the new transport code that actually comes into force in January. so very soon. And that is about allowing or enabling the mobility as a service market, so and all new services on the market. So the key idea there is that the public sector should actually only do services that are not interesting to the private sector, and leave all the business potential for the private sector. And there of course, we then see more innovation and more maybe user friendliness when kind of the public sector leaves the actual operations and innovation to the private industry.
Interesting. Now, we've talked a lot about flying cars, what's going on in Finland, but the future of cities is not just in the West. It's going on in sort of the emerging markets as well. And some of those issues are very different than we're facing sort of driving around London where I am. Josie, can you walk us through, again, some of the challenges that maybe the cities of tomorrow, if you're a megacity in an emerging country, is different than, say, if you're in New York? And how do you balance out the need to provide electricity, sanitary services, etc., with also people's desire to have the same cool stuff that someone in LA has?
We have several significant differences, some of which are easy to understand. The implications of some of which are easy to understand, others not so much. I mean, just tell you, most of European cities have a car ownership above 400 cars per 1,000 inhabitants, sometimes 600. In China, you're at about 150. In India, you're at about 20, with the exception of New Delhi, where you're at about 50. And it is inconceivable that we would be able to tell our colleagues in India, buying cars is a mistake, because all they have is dreaming about a car. But maybe we can tell them, why don't you buy a car and make it shareable with others at the times in which you're not needing it? This might even get you some revenue and get you an earlier access to owning the car. So there has to be ways in doing that. Another example is this notion of high occupancy vehicles, so the demand responsive little buses, etc. They have been existing in the third world for many years. The matutus and things like that, with one very significant difference, which is the bus goes when it's full. So it always travels full occupancy, and time is of lesser concern. But at least the notion of sharing is already there. So it could be possible to take advantage of the fact that most of these countries now have mobile phones, and see whether with a not so smart mobile phone we could develop some solutions which are similar to the ones they know, but would allow a better use of time. So it's really about not starting from where we are, starting from where they are, and understanding what are the risks that will come if they just copy what we've been doing, and trying to nudge them into something which is reasonably familiar to what they're doing, but puts them on a better track to have a more sustainable mobility. It's very difficult to give you general recommendations, because the case of Lagos will be very different from the case of Hanoi.
Yeah.
But using this kind of guidelines, I think working with the local actors, it should be possible to also help them, because many of the cities also have tremendous congestion and pollution problems.
Now, I've frankly lost count of the amount of cities Uber is in now, and a lot of the growth is coming from the cities that Jose just mentioned. When it comes to offering the services to your Uber customers, particularly those who maybe don't have access to a traditional bank account, how does Uber look at that when it looks to grow in Lagos, Hanoi, and elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, in those countries where credit card penetration is very low, we tried to go in and sort of see if we could drive credit card penetration, and that was hopeless. And so one of our key principles, was we wanted this experience to be end-to-end seamless. But it can't be seamless if you can't even pay for it. So we opened cash as a payment method, and that comes with some downsides for sure. But it also enabled these markets to kind of explode and take advantage of the ride-sharing kind of revolution and Uber pooling and everything else. And that's working. It's very much what you said. It's like there's this ubiquity of mobile devices. I mean, even in third world countries, everybody has a connected mobile device, or most people do. And so we're now the market leader in India. India, in the cities that we're in India. And the reason is because, we've enabled that, that growth. Now, I think the next step would be to do something like a wallet type of thing, where like a stored value type of scenario. So you sort of bring the safety and the sort of the seamlessness of the transaction back. But the near-term thing to do was to accept cash, and that worked extremely well.
So I'm going to play the Luddite in the room and the cynical journalist and say, the idea of a flying car or a car sharing service is great, but in the end, I just want to get from point A to point B. And as much as, a car sharing service might work, also owning a car might work. So walk me through why the current system isn't going to last for another 20, 30 years. Because in the end, there's a lot of inertia sometimes kicks in, but the changes need to be made. So maybe start off with sort of, when it comes to sort of the USP of what you guys are offering, if I'm a customer in Tampere, for example, why would I use you guys? Why wouldn't I just go off and buy a car?
Yeah, well, there is quite a funny thing in transportation that we are so used to owning cars, even though car is a terrible investment, so it doesn't really make sense. But still, we do that, and that's the biggest obstacle as well in all these new mobility services to the behavioral change. At the same time, the behavioral change is the driver for all this. At the same time, it's also the thing that slows down. So we are so used to owning cars, we don't even know how much the car costs. Actually, we've done some interviews with customers. We wanted them to tell us that how much does car ownership cost and what kind of costs are there. So they forgot a lot of things like insurances or inspections and so on. So it's hard to put a price on your mobility, and that's, I think, one of the obstacles in any mobility service, to compare the price. But it's everything about the freedom of mobility, really the flexibility, because of course the private car was the kind of freedom of mobility, or the symbol of freedom when we first had them. But now people are moving in cities, there is congestion, you need to find a parking place. If you use public transport, you still need to pay for the car because it's a fixed investment. So it's not actually that free anymore. So I'm certain that the new generation, they're actually looking for a new kind of freedom for mobility that is not the private car. It's something else. It's some kind of a hybrid combination of cars and public transport and maybe flying cars or all kind of things. And that's actually a big change because now we are used to the car. The car is the only interface to mobility, and we always take the car wherever we go. So the big transformation is also that we are going to use several services. So we need to make the interface still as easy as the private car is, because we know that people, mobility has to be easy. Mobility is something we do every day, so it has to be super easy. So we need to kind of package the whole mobility as one interface, even though we are utilizing many different transport modes.
And Jeff, again, to continue playing my devil's advocate role, why isn't Uber just another taxi service that has been around for generations? Well, what sets Uber apart, particularly when you are facing some regulatory setbacks worldwide? Where is Uber going to fit into the city of the future?
Well, I think the biggest proof that there's value to be found there is just the growth of Uber. I mean, people use it, and there's a reason for that. And it generally comes down to customer experience and cost. Any kind of disruption wave is driven by one of two things. It's either a 10x better customer experience or it's much better cost. And if you have both of those things, you kind of get a hyper-growth disruption wave, which is really what has happened with Uber. And so, why is it more convenient? Well, I mean, if you've ever been in a rainstorm in New York and been hailing a taxi and they're all off duty, and you're like, why are you doing that? And there's actually, the answer is not what people think.
What is the answer?
The answer is because they hit their quota and go home earlier. It's not because they don't want their car to get wet. People think, oh, they don't want me sloshing around in their car. They're going to wait for the rain to end. That is not the reason. They actually just get so many more trips. They actually go home early, so like everyone goes off duty at the same time. So you push a button and get a ride. Like in New York, also a great example is we just passed the number of trips being done by taxi with Uber in the city, which is a massive milestone because it's a more regulated city than other places. And we did that by not through trips in Manhattan, but by trips in the outer boroughs. Because the yellow taxis do 95% of their trips in Manhattan. They don't leave and go to the outer boroughs. So these people who live in the outer boroughs just aren't served at all. So there's a lot of problems that people don't realize with transportation. It's access to it, it's cost of it, it's convenience, it's safety. So the fact that we have a rating system, the two-way rating system, helps tremendously in terms of rooting out bad drivers and bad riders. So all of these little pieces that seem kind of insignificant, in sort of individually, when taken together, create an experience that people want to use. And I think that's going to be true with all transportation methods. Like, we're going to see, I think, another big watershed moment when self-driving becomes a scaled phenomenon, because the price of transportation will take another sort of significant quantum step down. And so you'll get all the convenience of, push a button and get a ride, and not having to park your car and deal with all this stuff. But then suddenly it is so cheap now, you're like, I can just use this all the time. And you suddenly realize it's not that you actually compare the economics to your own car, because you're right, people don't do that. What will happen is they'll just realize they're not using their own car anymore. And they'll be like, why do I have this? I go into the garage and tried to start my car, and it wouldn't even start because the battery was dead. So I think I'm going to sell this thing. And that's how it'll start in the current generation. And then the next generation won't buy cars in the first place. I mean, I think that's really what we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Josie, turning to you, I mean, we mentioned sort of the interest that might go against this, particularly sort of the taxi associations who have significant power, particularly here in Europe. As if policymakers are wanting to do this, and I don't think any policymaker is saying I don't want greater mobility for my citizens. That isn't the thing. But there is a significant amount of lobbying on the opposite side. We want more safety. We think there's no insurance issues. Yada yada yada. From a regulator or lawmaker perspective, how do you balance those two interests out? No, I'm not saying those interests are correct, but they're making a significant amount of noise. So, as a policymaker, how do you approach that?
Let me first cover something from the previous question.
Sure.
Why are people buying cars and using them so little, and not even care about how much it costs? It's a mixture of two things. It's very convenient when you need it, and you can afford it ultimately. Now bring in the electric cars. The marginal cost per kilometer at European prices of gasoline is 7 times lower. So it becomes even more affordable. The advantage of the demand responsive systems is that they can bring you the same level of convenience of your private car, just like Jeff was saying, which the traditional public transport would not give you, except if you happen to be served on the same metro line from origin to destination. And that has, in spite of all the investment that countries have made in the last 20 years, the market share of public transport has stabilized. Because as cities grow, it becomes less likely that you are served on the same line. And so transfers reduce the attractiveness of public transport. If you have demand responsive transport, takes you door to door or street corner to street corner, this will change. Now, coming to your question. I cannot count. It's not a question of secrecies. I've lost count when I was at the ITF. How many ministers have told me, Jose, I'm totally in for these new services, but you have to help me how to navigate it, how to get there, because I am under so much political pressure. I don't know how to do it, but I realize it's better. So it's really a question of the political battle. In the end, I am pretty sure that this will be contagious from one country to another, but also the big thing will be when Uber and the other companies become driverless. Because then it's not our drivers are more professional than their drivers or whatever, there's no driver. And it's safer. And then this kind of trade union dispute is a totally different battle.
You don't think people are going to say, I don't want that autonomous car taking my job?
They will. They will, but there will be many other people saying the same thing in other professions. But politically, I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm saying it's a different political battle. And ministers will be behaving, if as I expect, this will only come when it is very safe. And it will be about half of, maybe 2/3 of the current cost. And it will be, everything is recorded, so very safe, very secure. And it will be much more equitable. So you have a number of things that change the political landscape. And at the time, it will be a different discussion, and I think the penetration across the other countries will be much quicker. Let's see.
Let's see. So I'm conscious of the fact that we have 4 minutes left, and I want to open it up to questions. I could go on forever, but does anyone have a question for the panelists regarding the future of the cities, transportation?
And you have a mic? Oh, there is a mic.
Anyone? Okay, well, I'll just continue myself then. So I guess my question is this.
There's a question there, the lady there.
Is it working?
Yep.
So there's been an issue, I know, in San Francisco and about how you've had more of the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world, how traffic congestion has actually gotten much worse because now there are more vehicles and people are, they have ridership on Uni and whatnot has gone down. So I'd love to get some perspective on that. And is that a trend that you think continues? Is it at some point evolve? What's going to happen there?
I suppose I should talk to that, or do you want to talk to that?
Take it and then I'll...
Okay. Well, in San Francisco, the population's also significantly increased, and it's grown faster in the last, 10 years than it's grown for the previous 50. And so you're seeing, I think, a crunch from population growth. It is true that there's more, there definitely more. There's more usage of the vehicles on the surface roads instead of Muni and so forth. Although I take Muni sometimes and it's totally packed, so I don't know. Maybe that's just anecdotal, obviously. But the other sort of offsetting factor to that is in the ride-sharing model, these cars don't try to park. And so even if you're not pooling, and pooling is huge in San Francisco, it's our biggest city for pooling. It's up to 50% of our trips are pooled, depending on the sort of time of day. But even if you're not pooling, the lack of looking for parking takes about 25% of the traffic off the road during the primary hours. And so I don't think there's any. There's a thesis about this, but I don't think there's any data. It's very hard to get data on this type of thing. But there's, like I said, there are other factors that need to be considered that I think are really at play here.
Jose?
Yeah. In my 2 previous lives, one as a professor here in Lisbon and then at the ITF, we've looked at this from the perspective of the private people roaming in search of a parking place.
Yeah.
And the second one was when we were doing the simulations with the shared mobility solutions, the problem of roaming empty to position yourself better for the clients. Actually, in both cases, there has to be a solution that comes through smart charging. Particularly for the professional services, this should be coordinated from a central dispatch, which should be publicly managed, which says you are allowed to do a maximum of X percentage. Imagine 20% of your kilometers can be done empty. Otherwise, you should be parking and then moving when a client is calling you. And there should be, because of the reduction of use of private cars, a lot of parking space should be released, and part of that parking space could be used for this. So it's a problem that requires that you cannot allow each driver to be roaming empty in search for his clients, because then you increase a lot the traffic. But because all the movements can be known, the demand and the supply, by the central dispatcher, this can be easily managed to give a fair allocation of movement rights and business rights to all the providers, while keeping the number of empty vehicles roaming around limited.
Yeah, and we've seen that, just really quickly to add to that, we've seen that play out in our business. I mean, as the business is scaled, the amount of utilization of the vehicle goes up, and the amount of time between trips where the car is empty goes down. And on Uberpool, you actually have chain trips. So you have no time where there's nobody in the car, except if the driver needs to go to the bathroom or something. Yeah. So it really, at scale, these things actually really are very efficient.
Yeah. And I think with that, we are just out of time. So thank you so much for the panelists. Thank you so much for listening in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.